Good morning, everyone. And I'd at the onset like to thank the Vice Chancellor. I'd like to thank the university, and I'd like to thank CGR for providing me with this opportunity to make a presentation. My presentation is going to be giving a comprehensive overview and like an introduction to the Conference of Parties, which is what is actually providing the backdrop for today's roundtable conference. So it's essentially going to trace the trajectory in relation to the Conference of Parties, relation to climate change, because there are other conference of parties also that are held, but particularly the climate change COPs, Conference of Parties. First slide. Yeah. So before I go to the climate change conference of parties, so the presentation is divided into two parts. The first part is going to give the context which actually has led to the emergence of global thinking on climate change, countries coming together and having various agreements and conventions. So the first part is going to give that kind of background, and then I will move to the second part, which is going to specifically talk of the climate change conference of parties. Now, as far as the world is concerned, the changes related to environment actually started coming into limelight in the decade of 1970s, and then late 1960s there were several reports that had come up, and in 1970s the first conference related to environment was held, which was the Ramsar Convention in 1971. Can we just tap? The Ramsar Convention in 1971, which was on wetlands, and the very important convention on environment and development, which is the Stockholm Conference, was held. So each of these conferences are named after the place or the location where they are held. So the Stockholm Conference in 1972 was the first global environment international conference that was held. And it was also as a result of the Stockholm Conference that the United Nations Environment Programme, which is a body or agency under the umbrella of the United Nations, which looks specifically into environment-related aspects. So the UNEP, or the United Nations Environment Programme, was formed. Now, in 1980s, the depletion of the ozone layer above Antarctica also came to light. There was an article which was published in the Nature magazine, and then that's when the world just came together, decided to pull up their socks that this is something that needs to be addressed. Now, the Vienna Convention was held in Vienna, Austria, and this is where attention was drawn to the ozone layer depletion. And when countries came together, deliberated, thought, they decided that very clear action needs to be taken to address this. And as a result of this convention, the Montreal Protocol, which means coming together in agreement, what are we going to do? So you'll hear a lot of terms like protocols, agreements, mandates, which essentially refers to a kind of agreement. This is what we are going to do, a direction or a guideline, a document, and also points of action. So these are some of the common terms that are used in international conventions. And convention, we mean coming together, of different nations and countries. So the Montreal Protocol was signed. I'll talk of each of these specifically, but if we can move further. And moving further, in 1992, the Rio, or the Earth Summit, which is a very important, significant milestone summit, was held. And it was from here on that we see a change in the trajectory. So far we are broadly talking about environment at the global level. It was at the Rio Summit that then we get into specific issues of the environment. So you have biodiversity, you have climate change, and you have desertification. So from here on, different conventions or different bodies have been formed for each of these, and each of these then have conference of parties periodically. And so you have the Convention on Biological Diversity, which has a conference of parties every 2 years. You have the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which organizes its COPs every year. And then you also have the Convention to Combat Desertification, which is roughly 1 to 2 years. So what we are going to talk about today is the UNFCCC COPs. Can we move on? So if you see the trajectory, go back. If you see actually the trajectory, there are these dotted lines. So 1970s is when the awareness broadly on environmental concerns took limelight on the global stage, and then we see specific, actions. 1980s laid the background, and then 1990s specifically, we see a change in the trajectory. So as far as climate change is concerned, these are the significant events. You have the Stockholm Conference, you have the Vienna Convention, and in 1980s, you also have the formation and establishment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Some of us may have heard of this, which I'll talk about a little more, and then of course the 1992 Earth Summit. Now, the Stockholm Conference was actually the first major conference of the United Nations to address environmental issues, and it was held in Stockholm in Sweden in '72. It came out with the Declaration on Human Environment, which is that there is a need to have a common outlook and adopt common principles to preserve environment and also to enhance. So there is a dual role, not just preserve and conserve, but also to enhance human environment. And like I already mentioned, the United Nations Environment Program was set up after this. The Vienna Convention came together to address the specific issue of the ozone layer depletion and how that the ozone layer needs to be protected. So it was actually interesting because this was the first time that a convention was held and the world decided to take action before realizing the impacts of the change. So a very successful convention, and the result of it, because it also led to the Montreal Protocol, which essentially outlined which are the substances which need to be banned, which need to be stopped in order to address this ozone layer depletion. So it was a very successful global act. Next. Yeah. So if we look at this graph, here we see that because of adopting the Montreal Protocol and the action being taken on that, there is a stark reduction in the ozone depleting substances, the production of that. So if you look at 1990 to 2007, so you see the graph actually going down. So this is a significant achievement. Next. Now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed in 1988. It is a body of scientists. So there are thousands of scientists who are of this panel, and what it basically does is it reviews and puts together the latest research on climate change, and it comes up with reports. So its most key report is the assessment report, and there have been different assessment reports since the formation of the IPCC, and of course there are other studies that it puts together. So essentially what the IPCC does is evaluate the risks that climate change poses to us based on research. Thank you. Next. So I've already talked of the Rio Summit, so I'll skip this and move on now. Next, please. Yeah. So this is the broad trajectory that I traced, and from the Earth Summit, you have different trajectory for each, and this is what we are now going to talk about. So the UNFCCC was essentially formed to stabilize concentration of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. Now, why this specific role? No, and also to address global warming, to limit increase in average global temperature. Now, do you know the role of greenhouse gases? They keep the earth warm. If it wasn't for the greenhouse gases, then the earth would be a very cold place and we probably would find it very difficult to live, or maybe not live at all. But if there is more number of greenhouse gases, then the warmth will increase, the heat on the earth will increase, right? So this is what we call as global warming. Yeah? Now what happens when there is global warming? It also leads to changes in climatic patterns. This is what we are calling climate change, right? So this is the key mandate of the UNFCCC, which is to limit GHG emission into the atmosphere and keep global average temperature to a certain limit, so that we don't realize the impacts or effects of it, and particularly, due to the changing climate patterns. So we all already see the changes, due to climate patterns. So the recent floods in Chennai that happened, what had happened? What was the event? There was a cyclone called Michaung, right? So one of the effects of climate change is increase in frequency and intensity of cyclones. And of course, also the kind of urban infrastructure that we have, we are not very prepared to face disasters like floods. Now, the UNFCCC works very closely with the IPCC, which I just talked about. So they work very closely together. So IPCC will provide, the research and the reports, and the UNFCCC will actually take those reports, the evidence, the scientific research into cognizance, and then set out, the mandate for the different conference of parties, and then the nations have to accordingly take action. So if you look at this map, you see different shades here. So, and these are all the countries or nations which have signed up for the UNFCCC. So you have the Annex 1 countries, you have the Annex 2 countries, and the non-Annex countries. So Annex 1 countries are the ones here, which is former USSR, and also the ones in green. So mostly these are countries which have historically contributed a lot to greenhouse gas emissions because of the economic development or the kind of industrialization that they've had. So Annex 1 countries refers to those who have historically contributed more to GHG emissions. Annex 2 parties are those which are the industrialized economies and which are held accountable to support, particularly in terms of finance, the effects or the impacts in developing nations. So the Annex 2 countries are those. So Annex 1 also includes some of the economies in transition, like, after the breakdown of USSR, there are nations in Eastern Europe which come under economies in transition. So, but Annex 2 specifically refers to industrialized nations. So the ones in green, if you see all of this, excluding this. And the non-Annex parties are the developing countries. So there are 198 nations which are actually parties to the UNFCCC. Of course, to each of the COPs and the treaties that come out from the COPs, there's a different set of parties or non-parties. Now, when we say that, there are 198 parties to the UNFCCC or to, let's say, a protocol, when I said Montreal Protocol, what does it mean? It simply means that when a nation, there is a representative of every country who's there at these conventions, he will just sign, at if the country agrees to the convention, then they will just make a representative signature. But then once you go back to the nation, whichever is the decision-making body, that has to clear this representation. So in the case of India, for instance, it would be the parliament. So once that is done, then you become party to that convention or agreement. And usually there is a time period that is given to actually become a signatory to the agreement, about a year or so. Now, moving on, so that is the background or context which I wanted to lay down. Moving now to the climate change conference of parties. So now we've understood what the UNFCCC is and what its role is. So it's a body. Now, what this UNFCCC does is, in order to limit emissions of GHG, it brings together the 198 parties that I just talked about, brings them together every year in what is called the Conference of Parties. So now you understand why it's called Conference of Parties, parties being the 198 parties which are part of the UNFCCC. They all come together for a conference to deliberate, debate, negotiate on aspects, concerns which are being put forward by a scientific body based on evidence, which is the IPCC, right? So UNFCCC is working very closely with the IPCC and therefore setting the global direction as to how we need to move forward to address global warming and climate change. So today there is COP28 being held. So from the time it started, so it's the 28th Conference of Parties. So, which means if every year, so many, from the beginning, so many conference of parties have been held. Now, I'm not going to be talking of all the 28 COPs, I'm going to spare you that, but I'm going to talk about a few of the important milestone conference of parties, particularly the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, and in between just a handful of them which actually set the way for these two important conferences. Now, this is the journey that I would like to take you through. So the first conference of parties was held in Berlin in the year 1995, and what was discussed here is the Annex 1 countries, which are the Annex 1 countries, and so that mandate was set out in Berlin. Now, this actually opened the way for the Kyoto Protocol, because the Kyoto Protocol gives a very specific role to Annex 1 countries in terms of liability. So the Kyoto Protocol, again named after where it was held, Kyoto in Japan, was held in 1997. The Kyoto COP was held in 1997 in Japan, and as a result of this, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted later. So what the Kyoto Protocol actually set out was that the Annex 1 countries have the responsibility, because historically they have contributed more greenhouse gas emissions. They are the ones who have the liability to reduce the emission. And there were specific targets, quantified targets, which were given to these nations. So overall, they had to aim to reduce by 5%, about 5% to the 1990 levels. So whatever they were emitting in 1990, reduce by 5% of that. And this has to be done in a certain time frame, which is 2008 to 2012. Now, the Kyoto Protocol actually came into effect in 2005. So, a long time after, it was set out. So, 1997 to 2005 is a huge gap. So, 2005 is when it came into effect, because countries went back, to their nations, and then, the signing up and becoming parties takes time. And the target was to reduce these 6 greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, and others. So very clear-cut, very specific targets there. And it also provided with different mechanisms in which the countries can actually reduce their GHG emissions. So one is emissions trading, which is between the Annex 1 countries, they can be trading. The second was joint implementation, that you can implement projects together, developed nations. And the third was clean development mechanism, wherein you can actually support projects in the developing countries, and you can take the quantum of that to show that you have reduced this much GHG emission. So there were flexible mechanisms that were given to countries. So there were 192 parties to the Kyoto Protocol, and some of the industrialized nations committed to reduce. And this, of course, was later extended to a second commitment period. Now, moving on from Kyoto, in 2007, in the Bali Convention, so discussions started about, there needs to be rethinking on the differentiation that we have between Annex 1 countries and non-Annex countries. Should and non-Annex countries also be held accountable? And also, the 1990 reference base period, we need to relook and rethink about that. And very importantly, it also started a discussion on what we are talking about today, which is we have to have a cap on average global temperature increase. So the discussions on that actually started during Bali Convention. And then, of course, as a result of this convention, there was an action plan that was put together, and there were specific aspects which the countries, were encouraged to take up, which is related to mitigation, have specific national mitigation actions, have adaptation actions, and it also put forward the concept of RED, which is reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. So these were some of the aspects that came up in Bali, but importantly, this is what I wanted to put forward, the rethinking that started in Bali. Now, in Copenhagen in 2009, importantly was this aspect, which was, we can trace it back to Bali, which is the limiting of global temperature increase. This proposition was put forward that we should look at 2 degrees Celsius. So we can think how in the Paris Agreement, when we come to it, when the discussions actually began here. And 2 degrees Celsius above what? Above the pre-industrial level. So we are not talking of 1990, which we spoke of in the earlier conventions. And it was also here that $100 billion of funding was to be raised by 2020 to help developing countries cope with climate change impacts. And lastly, there was also talk of setting up a green climate fund. So all of this is also showing up in today's COP28, which is why I wanted to put this forward. So after Copenhagen, in Cancun, when 1 year later, when the Green Climate Fund was actually set up, and also, there was further, a more in-depth talking of reducing the distribution of emission reduction targets between different countries. So if we were to keep the global average temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius, base reference to pre-industrial, then how do we distribute the target? So this kind of discussion actually started in Cancun. In Durban, in South Africa, in 2011, there was further discussion on the same, and they started proposing that we also need to now look beyond Annex 1 countries. No? So we are also including non-Annex. So that kind of thinking has got deeper. In Doha, they decided to extend the Kyoto Protocol. So the first commitment period was from 2008 to 2012. In Doha, they decided that it can be now extended from 2013 to 2020. And moving further to the next COP, which was in Warsaw, the discussion started around INDCs, or the intended nationally determined contributions, which is what directs climate change talks now. So this discussion started, which are pledges that need to be made by individual countries. Why I'm talking about INDCs? Because this is what is the center of the Paris Agreement. Moving on to the next key milestone agreement, which is the Paris which came as a result of the Paris COP in 2015, which is the COP28. It actually saw participation of almost every nation and country, and the Paris Agreement was signed, and once this was signed, the Kyoto Protocol became ineffective. So remember, the second commitment period of Kyoto Protocol was 2013 to 20. So after this agreement came into effect, the Kyoto Protocol became ineffective. Now, what is this Paris Agreement? So the Paris Agreement key is that we are going to keep global temperature increase, limit it to above 2 degrees Celsius with reference to pre-industrial levels. But not just stop at that, actually make more effort and see if we can keep it within 1.5 degrees Celsius. So become a little more ambitious. And each of the countries now has to make a pledge. This pledge is what is called the nationally determined contribution. So we are no longer talking of only Annex 1 countries. We are talking of all parties. So each party has to make a pledge or a NDC, which is going to determine how it is going to contribute to what target? To limit global average temperature increase. So the action on mitigation, adaptation. Now, countries will of course make a pledge, but how do you ensure whether they are doing it or not? So there has to be a review mechanism, and the Paris Agreement said that after every 5 years we will take a stock. Oh, how far have we reached? Where else, what more do we have to do, and in order to reach our objectives. So it also set up a review mechanism. So from Kyoto to Paris, the key distinction that we see is that in the Kyoto Protocol, it was a top-down approach. So, quantified targets were given to Annex 1 countries. Whereas in the Paris Agreement, the nations had to decide based on their capability, based on their historical contribution. They can decide as to how they can contribute to emissions, to keeping global average temperature limited. So this was a bottom-up approach. Now, the last point that I mentioned in the Paris Agreement was setting up of a review mechanism. Now, this review mechanism is what is called the global stocktake, and the present COP28 in Dubai is very important because here the first global stocktake is being presented to the parties. And what the global stocktake does is basically give us evidence as to where we are, and therefore help us determine the future action, and also relook at the pledges that we have made, make more ambitious pledges. So by the end of the present COP, we will know how parties have actually made use of the findings of this global stocktake in order to relook at their pledges. and the outcome will be published at the end of the COP. So very briefly, the key findings that have come up from this global stocktake. So this review mechanism is also fairly, tedious process. You actually have hundreds and thousands of documents which are reviewed, which are analyzed, they are put together, and then it is presented to the parties at the COP, who then have negotiations based on it. So one important finding of the stocktake is that there is a huge emissions gap. If we are to achieve 2 degrees Celsius, that target, or even go further more to 1.5, we see that there is a huge gap, and it also puts forward the need to talk of phasing out of fossil fuels and the importance of making use of renewable energy. It also draws attention to finance for developing countries who have to cope with the loss and damage that is caused due to climate change, and also the not just the financial support but also the technology support that can be given to developing countries. If you look at this graph, now what we have here is the reference, the base reference level. Now what we have decided is 2 degrees Celsius, which is the one in orange, and if we are to reach more ambitious target of 1.5, then this is the graph. Now where the world is currently is this. So you see the huge gap. Yeah, and also the target is towards the end of the century, that is 2100. So very quickly, I think I'll just conclude in a couple of minutes. So at the present COP, what are the kind of issues that have come up and which have been put forth is one, the setting up of a $30 billion fund for addressing global climate solutions, and also to raise $700 million for loss and damage to help low-income countries. Also look at emissions from farming and agriculture. The talks have also thrown up that renewable energy capacity has to be increased 3 times, and also we need to look into how to double up energy efficiency. It is also proposed methane. I think ma'am also talked about the methane emissions and how we can look at having near zero methane emissions. And of course there has been a lot of talk around phasing out of fossil fuels, and there are several countries which have proposed this. Interestingly, India has been taking a back seat on this, though India was the one in the G20 meet that happened here. This is all kind of shaping up there. So far these are the quick updates on the COP that is happening in Dubai. So by the end of the COP we'll know whether it becomes the third or another significant milestone COP in this entire trajectory of climate change COPs, after Kyoto, Paris, and will Dubai actually hold the same place or not. So the idea of actually showing this entire trajectory is that there is a long drawn process and procedure to arrive at a single COP, what comes out and what is deliberated. And there is a link with the previous COP discussion. So, there is a cumulative building that happens. So if you see that in the first COP, they identified the Annex 1 countries, which actually then provided the base for the Kyoto COP and the Kyoto Protocol. And after Kyoto Protocol, they started discussions on, having a cap on global average temperature decrease, and also rethinking about this distinction between annex and non-annex countries. This further moved into the other COPs where funding was also called for, and then if you see, and this, redistribution of targets into other COPs, and how that formed the basis for the Paris Agreement, which is what is, the dominant framework today. And what remains to be seen is how it actually becomes a significant base for the Dubai COP. So with that, I will end my presentation. But before I end, I think I just would like to say, so this is what is happening at the global level, the COP, that is the Conference of Parties, right? But we are also at a COP today, which is the Conference of People. No? So the Conference of Parties is addressing climate change at a global level, seeing it as a global responsibility, and there's a global relationship with climate change. But I think we are all sitting here today at the Conference of People because climate change is the individual responsibilities there, like Vice Chancellor Ma'am had given out very specific action points that everyone can do. So it is not just a global responsibility, it is an individual responsibility as well. And why? Because each of us has an individual relationship with climate change. So Leela Ma'am actually, mentioned that how children are being encouraged in school to have their own individual relationship with environment. So each of us also has a relationship with climate change. Climate change affects all of us collectively, but also individually. Because therefore, this, I think, Conference of People is also to make us recognize that we have an individual responsibility, an individual role and relationship, to climate change. So that is all that I have. So I think more than that Conference of Parties at the global level, this Conference of People is very, very important. Yeah. Thank you so much.